Thank you. So I'll start. My presentation is on plurality versus purity of self in Zhuangzi and Kafka, and I investigate those two stories that portray human transformation into an insect. And I argue that those two stories ask to re-examine the humanness itself and the identity of those who are transformed. Kafka's Metamorphoses starts with this, the main protagonist, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up into his body of a giant bug, and his mental and physical capacities start to decrease from there. And Zhuangzi, on the other hand, as most of you probably know this very famous story, experienced something quite different. Experienced this very joyful experience of being a butterfly, and then when he wakes up, he's not so sure whether now he's a butterfly dreaming to be a Zhuangzi, or whether he's Zhuangzi who was dreaming to be a butterfly all the way. So I found it productive to read those two stories in parallel, because I think that even though they introduce kind of very similar narrative, they introduce this human transformation into non-human other, but at the same time, they have radically different implications on what humanity stands for and how we can kind of make sense of our own identity within the changes of circumstances, and also it challenges and kind of have different implications on what is human and animal relationship within different cultures. For both of the thinkers, for Kafka and Zhuangzi, the dream state seems to be a precondition for the awareness to arise. And I think that awareness can be understood interchangeably with consciousness. So it seems to be the case that in order to exceed oneself, in order to challenge one's own identity, there almost has to be like a certain cognitive shift. Because the dream state introduces the state when there is, when the self-awareness is kind of minimized, and we very often don't really have any kind of agency in narrating our dreams. So metamorphosis itself in Greek means literally after form. And I find it interesting that the god of dreams, Morpheus, is also strongly linked with transformation and is known as a maker of shapes. So it seems to be that this state of dream and the state of transformation is very strongly linked, because both of those states suggest that there is a certain lack of agency, and that human beings do not really have freedom to choose how to navigate the dream, or neither Kafka nor Zhuangzi suggest that you can willfully go back and forth within the transformation. And that the freedom of human beings start not within the again, trying to go back and forth, or within the narrating your own dreams, but within the awakening. And I think it correlates with this Albert Camus that at the end of the awakening, there is a consequence, which is suicide or recovery. And I think it stands very well for this Gregor and Zhuangzi respectively. Because the freedom is not upon choosing circumstances. It seems that it's a certain throwness that they experience in a Heidegger sense, something that they cannot really choose. But it's about how we face this shift within circumstances, and with this new identity that we embody upon the awakening. So Zhuangzi writes on dreaming that while it sleeps, the paths of soul cross. When it wakes, the body opens. So for Zhuangzi, the awakening is very linked with the openness of the body, very literally, Xingkai. While for Gregor, the experience is quite the opposite. Because for Gregor, quite literally, is kind of closes, because he wakes up in this state of a giant bug in the shelf, which indicates the shrink of his experience rather than expansion of it. And the very beginning of the novel starts with describing Gregor as monstrous, verminous bug. So there is this very strong intuition that we have upon reading the very first paragraph of the story. And even though Kafka really challenges, I think, some of the Greek mythology implications, he nevertheless continues the stream of Greek mythology. And I think that it's important to look at it and understand what monsters actually stand for in Greek tradition. So in Greek, monster, I think most of the time is represented as something, as a defect, a curse. So it's very often related with moral degradation, with something almost laid upon by gods for certain negative actions of the protagonist. It's also related with halfway living, because the monster is neither human being nor animal. And most importantly, monsters is always something that has to be overcome. So either has to go back in being human to kind of reverse the human form, or has to be defeated in a face-to-face battle. So there seems to be no place for this state of in-betweenness that I will be talking about shortly. And it's also interesting that monsters always large on the familiar, that it's always a combination of some of known that are distorted to the degree that throws us out of this habitual way of thinking. And I think it's especially clear in the Gregor sense, because Gregor's metamorphosis is happening in the constant within his family. So he's this very familiar, the member of a family that is distorted to something completely else. But the main point within my paper as well is that the fundamental feature of monstrosity is that there is no fundamental to it, that monsters lack essence in Greek sense, eidos, also known in Greek, because they always compose an entity of at least two beings, two entities. So this idea in Greek ontology that everyone has a certain essence, this essence that has to kind of bring order into universe became a central principle in the Greek ontology. And I think that it could be seen as a continuum in this nowadays known phenomena, psychological essentialism, which is a phenomena that human beings intrinsically have ideas that everything, every matter has a certain essence. So for example, that a dog has a certain essence that can be classified as a dog, and there is a very limited space in how much that essence can change to remain within the same category. But what is most important that the deviation from those essences is something that human beings seem to be really be uncomfortable with. And again, going back to psychology studies, the sense of in-betweenness, the sense this kind of state when it's very difficult to classify something into one or the other category, induces creepiness and disgust within human beings. So that people really have this disgust provoking sensitivities when they cannot classify things into categories. So for example, we can think of zombies, this very well-known monster that seems to be like a human being, while at the same time being something completely else. And this is something that's unsettling and kind of creepy for human beings. And when we look at purity in the Cambridge Dictionary, it's also defined as a state of not being mixed with anything else. So it's interesting that it actually stands as the antithesis for hybridity, for monstrosity. And therefore, I think it's not that surprising that monsters very often are seen as impure and unclean. It seemed to be the case that this in-betweenness and also discussed sensitivity that it kind of brought into is very strongly linked with moral judgments. So this landmark studies by Jonathan Haidt introduces that when human beings are exposed into disgust-provoking environment, they have much more harsh moral judgments, and that in those situations, we tend to judge others more negatively. And this is, I think, a crucial point in understanding hybridity and self and identity within Gregor's transformation, because Kafka is very careful, I think, and very deliberate at not trying to define Gregor in any way. He's not really putting him in any kind of category. The only thing that he says it's that it's a vermin, but vermin is a broad category containing rats, cockroaches, and so on. And it seems to be implied that Gregor still has this dispositions of humans, human and animal, so that there is this strong ambiguity within that. And that this ambiguity is something that seems to be seen as strongly linked with degradation of self, precisely because he starts to lack this essences, this eidos in a Greek sense. And here I think Zhuangzi also introduces this philosophy that is very useful to understand what's happening upon these moral judgments within Gregor, because Gregor himself, when he wakes up into this new state, he actually experiences almost a certain Zhuangzi joy, kind of running around, seeing, having many legs. It seems to be almost something pleasant about that. But what happens is that there is no place for him to expand and be aware of this new phenomenological experience, because the outside judgment by his family of trying to figure out where he stands now, and those moral judgments that are very strongly induced by disgust by his new state of being is so strong that it starts to little by little gradually demolish Gregor from the existence of being. So what happens here that Gregor cannot really be in the state of in-betweenness, that either he has to reverse in being human, this much more common narrative in the Greek tradition, but Kafka challenges that, and this never happens within the novel, or he has to be reduced to an animal, because in this case, it can be classifiable and can be dealt with. And we see that this is where he contrasts with the Zhuangzian understanding of self and identity. Because for Zhuangzi, this in-betweenness, this ability to move within forms, within bodies, is actually what expands oneself and what expands one's identity. So body in general is a very important term for Zhuangzi, and he uses different concepts in Chinese for body, but the most common one is xing, which, as Henry Roseman notes, this is the only term for body in Chinese tradition that has nothing to do with the person as a whole. That is, that it has nothing to do with a person being a part of social dynamics or being embedded in certain social situation. That Qing itself does not really have any kind of essence, any kind of purity, so to speak. That it does not really have any dispositions like Qing. And therefore, it has very malleable essence and this plasticity that can transform from human to animal to vegetable. So it's always plastic in becoming something else. And it's very well seen within this within the opening of Zhuangzi, the very well-known story when this fish kun transforms into a giant bug pung. So it's seen that within the transformation from birth, from a fish to a bird, it's not only that the body changes, but also that the identity changes with that, because Ming, the name of it, changes together with the body. So it seems to be implied that upon those radical transformations in life, upon those radical changes, the identity has to shift with that. That you cannot really remain the same, even within your own name, if you're kind of thrown in the situation that transforms you into something else, in literal and figurative sense alike. As Ham notices, when the form changes, designation corresponds accordingly to that. And this is probably the biggest difference within Gregor's transformation and Zhuangzi, because in Gregor's case, there is no identity shift. So he wakes up, and ironically, it seems that he's barely noticing this new existence. So he does understand that now he's in this giant body of a bug, but he still continues ruminating about his own job, responsibilities, and so on. And it seems that this experience that's supposed to shake him to the core is somewhat left unnoticed to some degree. So in this situation, it's almost implied that it's not as much as a human being as merely a clerk, so embedded in this treadmill of life and so intact with this identity that even this radical experience, the radical change within experience, cannot really throw him out of that. And I find it interesting that the Chinese word for self, or, is also intrinsically linked with something external, because it's derived from a hand holding an axe. So it seems to be that even when we make sense of ourselves, when we think about ourselves, it's very strongly linked with those identities that we have. Because axe, I think, implies a certain work, duty, identity, responsibilities, and that in a way, it's always, this self is always linked with roles and responsibilities that we live. And I think for Zhuangzi, freedom does not necessarily lie upon the complete escape from responsibilities. I think this is very common narrative, the way Zhuangzi is portrayed, because after all, Zhuangzi wakes up into being Zhuangzi. But nevertheless, it lies upon awareness that those identities that we have are very fleeting, and that they are not somewhat final, and that they are not fixed. And it's also, I think, that strongly linked for Zhuangzi with this idea of time, and that time is not the scarcest thing of life, because he has this passage, I think, that that kind of portrays Gregor's situation when he talks about human beings kind of rushing towards death, mindlessly living their identities, their responsibilities, without having any kind of awareness of their experience, and that the freedom lies in understanding that we live within those identities, and we change when the identities change, and when the transformation happens. So for Zhuangzi, I think it's not necessarily necessary to completely get rid of those identities, because we live in this constant accumulation of identities, even for Zhuangzi, who kind of accumulates the new identity of being a butterfly. But the key to awareness is to wake up, and upon the transformation, finding oneself being changed by the transformation. That I think that Zhuangzi, upon the awakening, is really not the same Zhuangzi that was prior to thinking of a butterfly. That this accumulation of identity also expands his sense of self. And another theme that I want to touch upon is that transformation always happens within the relationality of the animals. So whether it would be in Kafka's sense, or in Gregor's sense, or in Zhuangzian sense. And what's interesting in Kafka, that the radical otherness is really not monstrosity itself, not this monstrous being that Gregor becomes, because to some degree monstrosity is something that challenges, that brings novelty, that it requires attention. But the radical otherness becomes when Gregor is reduced to merely an animal, when he becomes the so-called it by his sister's words, when he's referred to as it, as a thing that is not even worthy of human judgment and human attention. And then exactly upon that moment, when he's reduced to an animal, at that point he can be eradicated, because he loses his superiority, he loses this humanness, even though within the novel he probably remains as the most humane character, full of compassion and understanding. This reduction of animal to something, to complete otherness, I think is very well pointed out by Derrida, who says that in the Western philosophy, animals were made, animal is a theorem, something seen and not seeing. That Gregor as well, he kind of lacks acknowledgement by others that he also has a genuine experience within being in the state of animal, or in the state of a monster. And that reduction someone to an animal is something that actually justifies violence. And again, going back to psychology, that the fastest way to kind of induce disgust about other human beings is also to reduce them to animals. I think one of the main takeaways from the Kafka story could be that that by dehumanizing, that by not taking animals stand seriously, by kind of seeing them not as equal participants of life, but as someone radical other, is not only that it justifies violence against them, but to some degree that it's also a way to justify violence against other human beings as well. Because a Smith study indicates, as for example, even when we think about radical eradication of certain group, a genocide, it also starts with categorizing humans as animals. If we could take this human being stand seriously, whether it would be in Zhuangzi's sense or in Kafka's sense, then we probably would have not even less violence against non-human others, but also consequently would not justify this reduction of human beings to an animals, that would also justify this violence against them. And that's also seen in the story of Hundun by Zhuangzi, when the chaos, the non-human other, is killed by putting human lenses and not letting to flourish this non-human other in its own terms. The formal and the final cause is the essences of things, this eidos and telos, ends, and in Greek ontology is probably where Zhuangzi differs most from Greek ontology, and that's also is reflected in Kafka's novel, because for Zhuangzi, it's not the purity that kind of has the highest sense of being, not those essences and the search for it, but plurality of things. And the purity in Zhuangzi's sense may decay faster than plurality, because plurality always ends up in hybridity, which also means novelty, which brings a certain fresh and also not discussed related perspectives. So the biggest difference, again, is that instead of searching for purities of things, Zhuangzi lets happenings to flourish and non-human others flourish in the state of in-betweenness that is very not accepted within the Greek ontology lenses. And that fluidity of self in general does not need to end to perfected ends, that it does not have to be reduced to one or the other end of the spectrum. So that would be all from me. Thank you.